So, after the involvement of the police, the next stop for a case as it proceeds through the criminal justice system is the jail. And the jail is one method of incarceration. And incarceration rates, by the way, another example of variation in law, incarceration rates vary quite a bit across countries. And the US has one of the highest incarceration rates in the world. And it's an incarceration rate that has increased substantially over time, over the past 50 or 60 years. And Americans are incarcerated in two major types of institution. One is the prison, which is for long-term incarceration. It's for people serving punitive sentences of a year or more. And the other is the jail. And the jail is for short-term incarceration, and so sometimes it's people serving sentences of up to a year, and a lot of the times it's people being held temporarily, like awaiting trial, or transferred to some other place. Now, at any given time, the prison population is larger than the jail population, but because jails are short-term, they cycle through many, many people. So time in jail is far more common than time in prison, and many more Americans will spend time in a jail than in a prison. The jail is a relatively modern institution, maybe even more so than the police. In older times in history, crimes were either handled by having the offender pay compensation, or by some sort of corporal punishment like whipping them, or if it was severe enough, by lopping off their head or otherwise executing them. By and large, people weren't punished by locking them up away from other people. And you did get some jails in ancient and medieval societies, but they weren't used extensively. They might have just been used for somebody awaiting trial to make sure they didn't flee, or awaiting execution. And this pattern carried over into early America. Jails were rare and rarely used in the early American colonies, partly because when you have a small, tight-knit community, the person fleeing isn't really that big of a risk. I mean, where are they going to flee to anyway in a colonial society where you're surrounded by wilderness or by tribes that aren't particularly happy you're invading their land? But as America grew, jailing became much more common and widespread. And looking at jailing in the modern U.S., 3 to 7 million people per year are jailed. Again, this is a very common experience relative to other kinds of incarceration. And most people who go through the jail are charged with minor crimes, things like disturbing the peace or driving while under the influence, versus, severe felonies like homicide or manslaughter or aggravated assault. One scholar who has studied jails is John Irwin, who wrote a book called The Jail, based on his own studies of jails in cities in California, as well as some research on the history of jails. And he came to the conclusion that one of the main functions jails serve in society is to help manage a social class he calls rabble. And he's using this term as like the kind of term that elites would probably use to refer to these people, just dismissing them as rabble. And he defines the rabble as the people in society with low respectability and low social integration, to use two terms from the theories of law we've already talked about. So people who have, a deviant reputation and aren't seen as respectable, and people who aren't particularly socially integrated, they're detached and marginal and not really plugged into mainstream society. Every sufficiently complex society has people of this type and tends to be concerned of how to manage them in some way, whether exiling them or segregating them to certain zones of the community, or putting them in jail, which could be seen as a kind of segregation or exile. And Irwin argues that the rise of jailing in history has corresponded to a rise in detached and disreputable individuals. You saw jails spreading in late medieval, early Renaissance Europe at a time when economic changes were shifting people away from the old village and farming lifestyle and leading to large numbers of people who had lost their land and were roaming about the countryside, not really owning land or not really sure how to make a living. So you had this giant rise in vagrancy, and you had a corresponding rise in law enforcement concerned with dealing with vagrants, and you had all these anti-vagrancy laws, and you had a greater use of things like jailing. And Irwin says this function of the jail has continued into modern society. And if you look at the population of people going through the jail, they're disproportionately people he would classify as being rabble, people who have low respectability and low social integration. Things like single men with no families or jobs, and maybe drinking problems and other history of deviance, are overrepresented in the jail population. And now, of course, given that jailing is such a common experience, other sorts of people will wind up in jail as well. It's not that unusual to wind up in jail. You could be an otherwise law-abiding person who has, a car accident when you've had a few beers and you wind up in jail that night for drinking and driving. But he's making a point about which type of person is most represented in the jail. Based on his research of jailing in California, Irwin comes to the conclusion that jail doesn't so much combat deviance as help reinforce it. Or the way he puts this is that, jailing is something that mostly reacts to people who are rabble, detached and disreputable. And the process of being jailed encourages them to continue being detached and disreputable. It reinforces this rabble status, and thus reinforces the person's vulnerability to being jailed. And this is a kind of argument you see again and again in legal studies by sociologists, this idea that sometimes the legal system has these counterproductive outcomes where it's actually increasing the very thing it's meant to be combating. And so Irwin, in his study of the jail, details all the ways in which incarceration can disorient an individual. It can be a very disorienting experience, a very frightening experience. If it's your first time being jailed, it's a scary thing to be arrested and taken to a jail and thrown into this new environment where there's a lot of people who are rougher than you and tougher than you, and you don't know necessarily the social rules of how to get along with people. It can also be a disintegrating experience, something that reduces social integration. The very process of being locked up in jail, even temporarily, like awaiting trial, can have social ties. If you have to spend a couple weeks in jail waiting for a trial because you couldn't make bail, you might lose your job because you can't just not show up to work for a couple weeks. And so there's one source of social integration gone. You've lost your job. People who are serving small sentences, a couple months or less than a year, they might, lose a boyfriend or girlfriend or spouse because they're away, and that stress breaks the relationship. They might not get to see their family very often because they don't get visitors. They're only allowed visitors at certain times, and the jail might be at a place that's very far away and inconvenient for their family to get to. It might be their family doesn't own cars and the jail's outside of city limits and the public transportation doesn't go that far. They're limited in their ability to contact people. So jail can be damaging to one's social integration. And he also argues it can be degrading. And here he's taking some ideas out of the labeling theory of people like Edwin Lemert and Howard Becker, the idea that when we punish deviants, there's often this kind of degradation ritual where we socially humiliate the deviant and lower their status. And yeah, sometimes this can have the effect of being a harsh lesson and deterring future deviants, teaching them, okay, don't do this, it's unpleasant. But it can also, by lowering their respectability, kind of make them adopt a self-label of being a deviant person and embrace a more deviant identity and come to reject the very norms we're trying to uphold. And he talks about all the ways in which the experience of being processed by the jail can be degrading for a person, how it's hard to keep clean and keep respectable. And you see people showing up to court dates, and you would think, why aren't you wearing a tie to court? You should try to look nice for the judge and, put your best foot forward and put the best image you can to the court. Well, if you've been in a jail for the past 2 weeks, that's a very hard thing to do. You might not be able to clean yourself properly, clean your clothes and shave and all kinds of stuff like that. So it can lead to this kind of degrading of the person and a lowering of their respectability in a way that then diverts them into a more deviant lifestyle. So the argument is that it's a kind of self-reinforcing process a lot of the time, where having low social integration and low respectability makes one more prone to be thrown in jail. But being thrown in jail then lowers one's integration and respectability, making further jail more and more likely in a kind of self-reinforcing process. And so the argument here is that this is one way in which criminal justice can be counterproductive. Rather than reducing deviance, it might actually increase it.